There are places in America where the dust never quite settles, where the air itself seems to carry the residue of old ambitions, the fine particulate of dreams that burned so brightly they left nothing behind but ash and the faint, acrid memory of smoke. In the last years of the 19th century, the country was such a place, vast and restless, and trembling with the peculiar electricity of a nation that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The railroads had stitched the continent together like a wound sutured in iron, and the telegraph had made distance a kind of illusion. And everywhere, in the parlors and the counting houses, in the barber shops of 1,000 identical towns, men spoke of money with the reverence that other centuries had reserved for God. It was 1898, and America was hungry. Not hungry in the way that animals are hungry, with the simple, honest urgency of an empty stomach. This was a subtler and more dangerous appetite. The hunger of a people who had been told repeatedly and with great conviction that the world owed them a transformation. That somewhere between the sweat of their labor and the prayers they whispered into the dark, there existed a mechanism, a lever, a secret passage through which ordinary men might step and emerge on the other side as something else entirely, something better, something free. Into this hunger stepped a man named Cornelius Ashby Vane. He was not by any conventional measure a remarkable man. He stood perhaps 5 feet 10 inches in his good boots, which were always good, always polished to a degree that seemed almost aggressive in its perfection. He had the kind of face that you would remember as handsome after the fact, though in the moment of meeting him, you might have struggled to identify any single feature that justified the impression. His eyes were a gray so pale they approached the color of winter sky, and when he looked at you, truly looked at you, with that particular quality of attention that made each person feel briefly like the only human being in the observable universe, something shifted in the chest, something loosened, something that had been clenched tight against the world released, almost against its will, like a fist uncurling in sleep. He had come to the town of Morrow Falls, Indiana, in the spring of that year, arriving on a Tuesday morning aboard the westbound from Cincinnati, carrying a single leather valise and a hat that cost more than most men in that town earned in a fortnight. He took a room at the Beaumont Hotel, which was the finest establishment in Morrow Falls, though the word finest should be understood as relative, as contextual, as belonging entirely to the modest grammar of that place and time. He paid 2 weeks in advance in cash from a roll of bills that the clerk would describe afterward as the thickest he had ever personally witnessed. He asked for the room with the best light. He ate dinner alone that first evening, and he ordered the most expensive item on the menu, and he left a tip that made the waitress go quiet for a moment before she thanked him with a formality that was almost shy. He did nothing for 3 days. He walked the streets of Morrow Falls in his polished boots, and he nodded to the men he passed, and he smiled at the women with a deference that was calibrated and complete. He sat in the barber shop and listened. He bought tobacco at the general store and listened. He attended the Thursday evening service at the First Methodist Church of Morrow Falls and sat in the third pew from the back, and he listened. He was listening for the particular frequency of a town's desire, and Morrow Falls, like every other town and every other county of that vast and yearning nation, was broadcasting it at full volume. He heard the miller complaining to the blacksmith about margins that had narrowed to the point of vanishing. He heard the blacksmith's wife telling a neighbor about her sister in Cleveland who had invested in something. She wasn't quite sure what, and had received a letter last month saying her investment had doubled. He heard the young men at the saloon talking about the war, the one that had just begun in Cuba, and underneath the talk of patriotism and adventure, he heard the older current, the one that ran deeper and colder, the current of men who understood that the surest escape from a life of diminishing prospects was a sudden, dramatic change in fortune. On Friday morning, Cornelius Ashby Vane walked into the offices of the Morrow Falls Courier and placed an advertisement. The advertisement was small, deliberately so. It occupied a modest rectangle in the lower right corner of the second page, and it said only this, that a representative of the Continental Prosperity Exchange was available for private consultation at the Beaumont Hotel, by appointment only, for a limited time. It gave no further details. It listed no figures, made no promises. It was the most restrained advertisement that editor Harold Graves had seen in 20 years of running that paper. And he told Vane so. And Vane smiled and said that he had found in his experience that the quietest voice in a loud room was inevitably the one that people most wanted to hear. By Saturday afternoon, there were 11 men waiting for appointments. The first man through the door of Vane's hotel room was Thomas Elias Hooper, a grain merchant of 53 years, whose fortunes had declined in inverse proportion to his confidence in their eventual recovery. He sat in the chair across from Vane's small writing desk and looked at the room, which was immaculate, which smelled faintly of cedar and bay rum, which contained on the windowsill a single leather-bound ledger that Vane did not open during the entirety of their conversation. Hooper had expected a salesman. He had braced himself against the familiar machinery of persuasion. The inflated claims, the testimonials, the charts showing lines ascending at impossible angles. He got none of that. What he got was a conversation about wheat futures, about the structural inefficiencies of commodity markets, about the way information traveled through the financial system, and how those with access to certain intelligence— here Vane paused, delicately, as if this were a point of some professional sensitivity— those with access could position themselves ahead of movements that ordinary investors would only recognize after the fact. Hooper left without investing. But he came back the following Tuesday, and he brought his brother-in-law, and he invested $340, which represented approximately 1/5 of his remaining liquid capital. And he shook Vane's hand with the slightly desperate grip of a man who understands that he has just made a decision from which there is no clean retreat. This is the mechanics of it, if you want to understand how these things work. Not the mathematics. The mathematics are simple enough, almost insultingly so, once you stand outside the structure and look at it clearly. The mechanics are the human part, the part that requires a particular genius, a particular understanding of the interior architecture of hope and fear and the peculiar shame that attaches to both. The first investors are never the greedy ones. They are almost always the cautious ones, the careful ones, the men and women who have spent their lives being prudent and have arrived at middle age to discover that prudence is its own kind of poverty. They invest because something in the presentation, in the quality of the attention, in the calibrated restraint of the promise, in the very absence of the hard sell, convinces them that this time is different, that this particular door, in this particular wall, leads somewhere real. And for a while, for the investors who came early, it did seem real. Vane's operation was elegant in the way that certain traps are elegant, constructed with a care and patience that might, under other circumstances, be called artistry. He established the Continental Prosperity Exchange as a formal entity, filing papers with the county clerk, renting a small office on Commerce Street that he furnished with the specific gravity of institutional permanence. Heavy oak desks, framed certificates of a vaguely financial nature, a secretary named Miss Emmeline Thrush, who was 24 years old and possessed of an efficiency so formidable it seemed almost architectural, and who had come to Morrow Falls from somewhere that she mentioned rarely, and in terms that discouraged follow-up questions. The exchange, Vane explained to each investor in turn, operated on a principle he called the rotational advantage. He spoke the words with a care that suggested he was sharing something that existed at the outer edge of what could be publicly disclosed. The principle involved the coordinated purchase and rapid resale of agricultural commodity contracts. Wheat primarily, though corn and timber futures also featured in the explanation, which shifted and adapted with a fluency that, in retrospect, was its own kind of warning. The returns were not guaranteed, Vane was careful to say. He never guaranteed anything. He merely shared, in a spirit of collegial transparency, what the historical performance of the strategy had produced. And the numbers he shared, delivered without emphasis as though they were mere facts, the kind of modest, credible facts that a prudent man might actually believe, were remarkable, not obscene, not the feverish projections of a carnival barker, simply remarkable, in the quiet way that a perfectly maintained orchard is remarkable, abundant without ostentation. Within 2 months of opening his office on Commerce Street, Cornelius Ashby Vane had collected investments from 47 residents of Morrow Falls and the surrounding townships. The total sum was somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000, which, in the autumn of 1898, represented a weight of trust so considerable it should have felt heavy. It did not seem to feel heavy to Vane. He wore it with the same equanimity with which he wore his polished boots and his expensive hat, with the practiced ease of a man who has long since made his private accommodation with the distance between appearance and reality. The first payments went out precisely when promised, to the day, almost to the hour. Thomas Elias Hooper received his first quarterly return and sat at his kitchen table and counted the bills twice, and then a third time, and felt something that he would later struggle to name, something between relief and a faintly vertiginous joy, the sensation of a floor appearing beneath a fall. He told his wife. His wife told her sister. The sister told her husband, who was a surveyor named Clement Ash, who had spent 15 years triangulating the boundaries of other men's property and had developed, in the process, a rather refined sense of where he himself did not stand. Clement Ash arrived at the Continental Prosperity Exchange on a Wednesday morning with $400 in a canvas bag and the expression of a man who is making a decision he will defend to his death. This is how the circle grows. Not through advertising, not through the mechanisms of ordinary commerce, but through the most powerful transmission system human beings have ever devised, which is the testimony of a trusted neighbor. The investor who has received his first payment is not merely a satisfied customer. He is a convert. He carries the evidence of his conversion in his hands, literal, paper evidence, the bills that prove the mechanism is real, and he delivers it with the evangelical sincerity of someone who has been changed. He does not know that he is part of the mechanism. He does not know that the money he received came not from the profitable rotation of commodity contracts in distant markets, but from the investments of the people who came after him, and that the money those people will eventually receive will come from the people who come after them, and that this elegant wheel of apparent abundance requires only one thing to keep turning: more people, always more people, always the next circle, always the outer ring expanding to feed the inner one, always the horizon receding at precisely the speed at which it is approached. By November of 1898, the Continental Prosperity Exchange had extended its operations to 3 neighboring towns. Vane made the rounds himself, in a hired buggy, spending 2 or 3 days in each location before returning to Morro Falls. He was systematic in a way that suggested deep reserves of patience, a quality that, like most of his qualities, serves simultaneously as genuine character trait and tactical asset. In the town of Garfield's Creek, he made the acquaintance of a widow named Mrs. Dorothea Petrie, who had inherited a modest estate from her late husband and had been managing it with the anxious competence of someone performing a role for which they had received no training. She invested $800. In Holt County, he found a consortium of small farmers who had been discussing, in their guarded and circuitous way, the possibility of pooling resources against the serial misfortunes of weather and market. He met with them 3 times before they arrived at the number: $2,200, assembled from the careful savings of 11 men who understood, all of them, what it meant to save that kind of money, who had built it dollar by dollar against the constant gravitational pull of contingency. There were people who were skeptical. There are always people who are skeptical, and this is worth understanding. The skeptics are not simply smarter, or more cautious, or more worldly than the believers. Often they are none of these things. Often the skepticism belongs to the same emotional territory as the belief. It comes from the same wound, the same accumulated experience of disappointment, the same interior record of promises that dissolved on contact with reality. The difference is only in the direction of the reflex. The believer leans toward the light because she has been cold too long. The skeptic turns away from it because she has been burned. In Morro Falls, the skeptic of record was a man named Ira Stillwater, who ran the hardware store on the corner of Commerce and Maple, and who had opinions about everything, which he delivered in a voice like gravel being dragged across a wooden floor. Stillwater had looked at the advertisement in the Courier and felt the specific irritation of a man who can smell the shape of a swindle even when he cannot see its edges. He had gone so far as to draft a letter to the county sheriff, a man named Ezra Bunch, who was conscientious within the narrow limits of his experience and jurisdiction. Sheriff Bunch had listened to Stillwater's concerns with the careful attention of someone who understands that he is hearing a complaint about something that does not yet constitute a crime, and had said that as far as he could see, the Continental Prosperity Exchange was a legally registered business operating within the law, and that until it did something that was against the law, there was nothing he could do, and that perhaps Stillwater was being somewhat uncharitable. Stillwater was not uncharitable. He was correct. But correctness, in those months in Morro Falls, Indiana, occupied a very particular and poorly lit corner of the room, and people were disinclined to stand in it. What Vane understood with the instinctive precision of someone who has studied human nature not in books, but in the faces of people deciding whether to trust him, was that the most dangerous moment in any scheme of this kind is not the beginning and not the end, but the middle. The beginning is easy. The novelty, the restraint, the performance of credibility, these are manageable variables. The end, when it comes, will be managed by distance and velocity, by the simple physics of a man and his valise being elsewhere before the machinery stops. But the middle is treacherous. In the middle, the weight accumulates. In the middle, the questions become more specific, the investors more numerous, the network of mutual acquaintance more dense and interconnected. In the middle, a single conversation that goes wrong can propagate through a community like a crack in ice, silent and invisible until the surface gives way all at once. He managed the middle with a technique that was, in its way, a kind of genius. He created what he called the senior partner tier, a select level of investment open only to his most established participants, offering higher returns in exchange for a larger commitment. The genius was not the additional investment it secured, though it secured considerable additional investment. The genius was what it did to the people he selected. To be elevated to the senior partner tier was to be trusted by a man who seemed, in all visible ways, to be a person of extraordinary discernment was to have your own discernment validated. The senior partners became, without understanding their role, the most effective instruments of Vane's credibility. When a doubter in the community raised questions about the exchange, they were met not by Vane's own assurances, but by the calm, unimpeachable testimony of Thomas Elias Hooper, who was a grain merchant and a Methodist, and a man whose word in this community was, or had been, as solid as anything you could point to. December came. It came with the particular severity that the Indiana plains generate in their flat, undramatic way. Not the theatrical violence of mountain winters, but a cold that settles in and stays, that makes the world look like something under glass, still and etched and permanent. Vane maintained his office hours. He maintained his hotel room. He sent out the quarterly payments with the regularity of a tide, and each payment that arrived in each kitchen and each counting house and each parlor added another layer to the sediment of belief that was slowly and visibly burying the capacity for doubt. There was a woman in Morrow Falls named Clara Hobart, and it is with Clara Hobart that this story finds its moral center, if moral center is the right phrase for something so human and so ordinary and so irreversible. She was 31 years old, a schoolteacher, the daughter of a farmhand who had died of something that nobody had been quite able to name, and everything that poverty will eventually do to a body. She was not wealthy. She was not what you would call financially sophisticated. But she was the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself, that moves quietly through the world in the form of careful observation and a memory that retained not just facts but textures, the feeling of things. She had saved, over 8 years of teaching, the sum of $460, which she kept in an account at the Morrow Falls Savings and Trust, and which represented, in her own understanding of it, her future in its most concrete available form. She had watched the Continental Prosperity Exchange arrive in her town with the same watchful attention she brought to everything, and she had felt the pull of it, the genuine allure that emanated from the idea of that money growing at the rates being whispered about in every conversation she was part of. She had spoken to Thomas Hooper's wife, who was a friend of hers, or close enough to a friend that the distinction didn't matter. She had walked past the office on Commerce Street more than once and looked at the solid oak furniture visible through the window and the framed certificates on the wall, and Miss Emmeline Thrush's composed and competent profile as she worked at her desk. And she had felt the thing she was supposed to feel, which was the conviction that this was real, that real things looked exactly like this. She made an appointment for the 15th of January, 1899. She made the appointment in the spirit of due diligence, telling herself that she was gathering information and had not yet decided anything, which was not entirely untrue, but was not the whole truth either. She was already, in some portion of herself, decided. She was decided in the way that people are decided when they have been offered the exact thing they needed and have not yet found a reason that is sufficient to decline it. She did not keep that appointment. What intervened was not the county sheriff and not Ira Stillwater, and not any of the mechanisms that are supposed to protect people from this kind of loss. What intervened was a letter. The letter came from her cousin in Columbus, Ohio, a woman named Ruth, who worked as a clerk in a law firm and who had, 3 weeks earlier, copied out a notice from a legal publication that described the investigation of a man named Cornelius Marcus Webb in the state of Ohio for conduct involving what the document called a system of rotational investment contracts. The description was careful and specific. The mechanism was, in every detail that mattered, identical to the Continental Prosperity Exchange. Clara Hobart read that letter on the morning of the 14th of January, sitting at her kitchen table with the gray winter light coming through the window and the stove giving off its modest, indifferent warmth. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. Then she put on her coat and her boots, and she walked through the cold to the hardware store on the corner of Commerce and Maple, and she went inside, and she stood in front of Ira Stillwater, and she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, that she thought he had been right about something, and that she thought they needed to talk to the sheriff again. What followed was neither swift nor clean. These things never are. The mechanisms of justice in a small Indiana town in January of 1899 moved with the specific friction of institutions that had not been designed for this kind of problem, that possessed all the formal apparatus of authority and very little of the practical competence that the situation required. Sheriff Bunch wrote to his counterpart in Columbus. His counterpart in Columbus wrote to someone else. Letters crossed in the mail, clarifications were requested and sent and arrived out of sequence. There were people in Morrow Falls who, when Clara Hobart's concerns became known in the community, as they immediately did, because in a small town privacy is largely theoretical, accused her of jealousy, of small-mindedness, of the particular female distrust of male enterprise that was, they suggested, both common and unfortunate. Thomas Elias Hooper heard the concerns and dismissed them. He had received 3 quarterly payments. He had the money in his hand. He was a senior partner. He knew what he knew. Vane himself, when the rumors reached him, and they reached him within 48 hours, because Miss Emmeline Thrush had her own reasons for careful attention to the community's mood, showed no visible sign of concern. He continued his office hours. He continued to receive investors. He continued to project the specific, calibrated quality of unhurried permanence that was his most finely tuned instrument. But the valise was already packed. Not literally, perhaps, but in all the ways that mattered. The accounts that existed under the name of the Continental Prosperity Exchange had begun their quiet, careful migration toward forms and locations that were more mobile. Vane had been here before in Ohio, and perhaps before Ohio in places that the record either does not contain or has chosen to forget. And he understood with the precision of hard experience the exact temperature of a situation, the precise moment at which the warmth of accumulated trust begins its shift toward the chill that precedes collapse. He left on a Thursday morning, in the second week of February, on the eastbound train. He checked out of the Beaumont Hotel with the courtesy and composure that had characterized his entire stay, leaving a generous gratuity for the chambermaid. He tipped his hat to the clerk. He carried his leather valise. He was gone before the first frost had left the window panes of Commerce Street. Miss Emmeline Thrush did not accompany him. Whether this was by design or necessity, or something else entirely, some failure of arrangement, some choice made in the brief interior darkness that even the most practiced deceptions cannot entirely illuminate, is not known. She remained behind, and what she faced in the weeks that followed, the questions and the accusations and the particular form of community fury that attaches itself to the nearest available target when the primary one has escaped, she faced with the same formidable composure she had brought to every hour of her time in that office. She said very little. She knew, it seemed, how to be silent in a way that occupied the same territory as dignity. The losses, when they were finally counted, amounted to somewhere between $38,000 and $46,000, depending on whose accounting you trusted and how you defined what had been lost. The range itself is instructive. The uncertainty about the precise sum reflects the larger uncertainty that settled over Morrow Falls and Garfield's Creek and Holt County in the months after Vane's departure. People were not always sure what they had given, or when, or under precisely what terms. The documents they had been issued were convincing in appearance and nearly worthless in law. The contracts were carefully worded in ways that promised less than they implied and implied more than they delivered, and unraveling the language of them required legal expertise that was expensive and slow and ultimately inconclusive in several key respects. Thomas Elias Hooper lost $340. It was not enough to ruin him, but it was enough to change something in him, some internal alignment, the way a hairline fracture changes the load-bearing capacity of a beam without making it immediately obvious. He spoke less. He listened less carefully. He developed in the years that followed a hostility to novelty that expressed itself in small, daily acts of refusal, a turning away from the unfamiliar that had not been part of his character before. Whether this was wisdom or its counterfeit is a question that does not resolve cleanly. Clement Ash, the surveyor, lost $400. He did not speak of it publicly. He returned to his work with a concentration so absolute it became a kind of armor, and if anything in him softened or broke, he kept it in a place that the available record cannot reach. The widow Dorothea Petrie of Garfield's Creek lost her $800 and spent the better part of a year in what her neighbors described as a peculiar quietness before returning gradually to something that resembled her former self. She never spoke publicly about what had happened. She attended church. She kept her garden. She survived. The farmers of Holt County lost their $2,200, which had been assembled from the savings of 11 men, and the dissolution of the consortium in the aftermath was more painful in some respects than the monetary loss itself, the recriminations, the displacement of private shame into public anger, the fractures in relationships that had been built over years and could not be rebuilt on demand. Clara Hobart kept her $460. This is the end of her story as far as the record goes, and it is both the simplest and the saddest ending in this particular inventory. She kept her money. She continued to teach school. She continued to be the kind of intelligent that moves quietly through the world, and whether that intelligence brought her the life she had worked to preserve the possibility of, the record, as I say, does not tell us. Cornelius Ashby Vane, or Cornelius Marcus Webb, or whatever name preceded that one and whatever name followed it, was never apprehended for what he did in Morrow Falls, Indiana. He surfaces briefly in a Philadelphia newspaper in the summer of 1899 in an item about a new investment enterprise called the Atlantic Commerce Society. The item is favorable. It describes the founder in terms that are, by now, entirely familiar. The restraint, the credibility, the specific quality of unhurried permanence. There is a grave in a cemetery outside Cincinnati, Ohio, that bears the name Cornelius A. Vane, with dates that would place his death in 1923. Whether this grave belongs to the man who walked the streets of Morrow Falls in polished boots is unknown. Cemeteries, like schemes of this kind, are full of names that do not quite correspond to the things they mark. What remains and what has always remained is not the money and not the man, but the mechanism. The mechanism is older than 1898. It is older than America. It is as old as the human arrangement of desire and its exploitation, as old as the gap between what people have and what they have been persuaded to believe they might have, as old as the peculiar alchemy by which that gap becomes, in the hands of a certain kind of person, an instrument of extraction so precise and so intimate that it reaches not merely into the pocket, but into the deeper pocket, the one that holds the things a person cannot afford to lose, the hope, the trust, the private conviction, nurtured against all evidence, that the world contains doors that open onto rooms brighter than the ones you're standing in. In the last years of the 19th century, America was a place that believed in transformation. It had been founded on that belief, had organized its entire mythology around the proposition that the self was not fixed, that circumstances were not permanent, that somewhere between the raw material of a life and the finished form of a destiny, there existed a process that could be accelerated, unlocked, purchased, perhaps, if you knew the right price and the right door and the right man with the right hat, standing in the right light on a Tuesday morning in spring. The dust settles eventually. It settles on everything. On the office on Commerce Street, which was rented by a dry goods merchant the following spring and showed no remaining trace of its former occupant. On the ledger that sat on the windowsill in the hotel room, the one Vane never opened in front of his investors, because it was empty, because it had always been empty, because the power of an unopened ledger lies precisely in what cannot be verified. On the names in the county records, the ones who signed their names on documents that promised something that could not be delivered, who picked up their pens with the earnest, careful precision of people accustomed to taking their agreements seriously, who pressed the nib to the paper in the good faith that is, perhaps, the most human thing of all. The October light falls across the plains of Indiana in a particular way, long and slant in the color of old gold, the color of a promise that is mostly beautiful and only a little bit a lie. In the barbershops and the parlors and the general stores of 1,000 towns that no longer exist in the forms they held in 1898, the conversations continue. They continue in forms that have changed almost entirely, and in a substance that has not changed at all. The same hunger, the same electricity, the same man in the same good boots, arriving on the same train from somewhere else, carrying the same leather valise and the same pale eyes, and the same particular quality of attention that makes each person feel, briefly and fatally, like the only human being in the observable universe. We are, all of us, in some portion of ourselves, waiting for that man, waiting for the door he will tell us about, the one in the wall we have been pressing our hands against for years without finding the seam. This is not stupidity. This is not weakness. This is the condition of being alive in a world that is simultaneously less than sufficient and more than bearable. A world that generates, in the space between those two states, the particular quality of longing that certain men have always known how to find and hold up to the light, so that it gleams like something real, so that it gleams like a way out, so that it gleams and gleams and gleams until the morning comes and the train is gone and the office on Commerce Street is dark and the ledger is empty and the dust has begun, slowly, inevitably, to settle on everything that was left behind.